In the dim corridors of history, where the echo of war still lingers like smoke that refuses to clear, there exist fragments of stories deliberately buried under seals of secrecy. They are not the celebrated victories sung in public squares, nor the noble sacrifices carved into marble memorials. Instead, they are the erased lines, the redacted reports, and the destroyed pages of dossiers that governments swore never existed. Files locked in military vaults bore stamped warnings. Do not release, do not acknowledge, destroy after reading. Yet the shadows of these operations remain too stubborn to vanish. They resurface in fragments: a faded photograph in an officer's chest, a misfiled telegram in Soviet archives, a Gestapo memo hidden beneath a bureaucratic stamp. Each fragment, when assembled, reveals operations conceived in the darkest corners of the Second World War. They were plans where deception outweighed strategy, where lives were currencies in power struggles, and where betrayal did not respect the line between ally and enemy. These were events so dangerous, so politically corrosive, that even decades later, governments chose silence over disclosure. But silence is fragile. The weight of truth presses against it until cracks appear. From Belarusian forests where men wore stolen uniforms, to alpine valleys wired with explosives, to Baltic convoys sailing under false flags, the unacknowledged history of World War II stretches like a hidden second front, a war behind the war. What you are about to hear is not myth or speculation, but the recovered fragments of forbidden operations, long suppressed, now resurfacing from the shadows. Chapter 1: The Black Files of Operation Iron Wolf. The first fragments of Operation Iron Wolf surface not in Berlin, nor in Moscow, but in a forgotten warehouse outside Minsk. In the early 1990s, as Soviet authority crumbled, Belarusian archivists uncovered boxes marked with the insignia of the NKVD. Inside were brittle interrogation transcripts, blurred photographs, and maps annotated with red pencil. The papers bore cryptic references to a German infiltration unit moving through the occupied territories in 1943, wearing Red Army uniforms and carrying forged Soviet orders. For decades, these files were sealed, dismissed as routine counterintelligence chatter. But closer study revealed something far more chilling. A deliberate attempt by the remnants of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, to destabilize Soviet command structures through deception and sabotage. The codename given was Eisenwolf, Iron Wolf, a fitting mask for a predator hiding among its prey. In the summer of 1943, as the Wehrmacht reeled from losses at Stalingrad and Kursk, German command recognized that conventional offensives could no longer deliver strategic victory. Instead, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's surviving networks within the Abwehr proposed an unconventional form of warfare. The plan relied on infiltration teams composed of Waffen-SS commandos, men trained in languages, dialects, and Soviet drill routines. Documents seized from Gestapo File No. 17 detail how entire units memorized Red Army insignia placement, salute forms, and the cadence of Soviet marching songs. Each commando carried forged papers, some bearing the signatures of actual Soviet generals, copied from documents taken in battlefield seizures. They were not sent to fight in open battle, but to penetrate supply lines, destroy morale, and ignite paranoia among Soviet brigades already stretched thin across the Belarusian front. Soviet counterintelligence caught whispers of Iron Wolf in late August 1943, when NKVD patrols arrested a supposed Red Army lieutenant near Smolensk. His uniform was correct, his documents flawless, but when pressed under interrogation, inconsistencies emerged in his recollection of unit histories. Within days, his story collapsed, revealing him as an SS operative from Königsberg, fluent in Russian, but unable to disguise his Prussian accent under duress. The NKVD report, declassified only in 1976, notes chillingly: Subject's mission: sow mistrust between Soviet divisions by transmitting falsified orders, redirecting troop movements, and sabotaging railway hubs. The revelations suggested that at least 4 infiltration groups were already active deep within Soviet lines. The strategy proved devastating in execution. In early September, a Soviet regiment stationed near Vitebsk received orders, carried by supposed Red Army couriers, instructing them to redeploy eastward to reinforce another sector. The orders bore the correct stamps, signatures, and seals. The regiment obeyed. Within hours, German artillery pounded their abandoned positions, and panicked Soviet command scrambled to locate the missing unit. Similar incidents rippled through the front. Bridges destroyed before reinforcements could arrive, ammunition depots mysteriously detonated, and patrols ambushed in places they had been ordered to march by supposedly legitimate command. At least 2 brigades suffered catastrophic losses, not from superior enemy firepower, but from the chaos of following poisoned directives. The Wehrmacht's files suggest that Operation Iron Wolf's handlers operated out of East Prussia, transmitting updates through encrypted radio channels, yet a series of Gestapo memoranda hint at something far more unsettling. Coordination with foreign contacts secured, neutral channels maintained. The vague language led post-war analysts to suspect the involvement of intermediaries in neutral states, possibly Sweden or Switzerland, who provided safe communication routes and smuggling corridors for forged documents and supplies. These intermediaries ensured that the infiltration units could be resupplied with weapons, maps, and disguises, all without attracting Soviet suspicion. As the NKVD intensified its sweeps, paranoia spread like wildfire. Soviet officers began demanding personal confirmation of orders directly from headquarters, delaying operations by days. Soldiers scrutinized comrades for unfamiliar accents, unusual gestures, or improper salutes. In some cases, entire units executed suspected infiltrators on the spot without trial, convinced that Iron Wolf's agents lurked among them. One recovered NKVD transcript describes a night in October 1943 when a battalion in Belarus shot 3 of its own sergeants, mistaking them for disguised Germans. The atmosphere of mistrust crippled cohesion, precisely as the Abwehr had intended. Despite the chaos, Soviet counterintelligence slowly tightened its net. By November 1943, NKVD reports list at least 27 suspected infiltrators captured, many of them Waffen-SS specialists. Interrogations revealed meticulous training programs at facilities near Königsberg and Danzig, where commandos were drilled not only in Russian language but also in Orthodox rituals, Red Army slang, and even the habits of smoking cheap papyrusy cigarettes. Captured documents detail one operative's handwritten notes. Remember, Soviet officers never address enlisted men by surname only. Always include rank. Failure means exposure. Such attention to detail reflected the operation's sophistication, but also underscored its fragility. Any slip could unravel the disguise. The ultimate failure of Iron Wolf remains shrouded in uncertainty. Soviet archives suggest that a major breakthrough came when a captured courier revealed the cipher key used for transmitting orders back to East Prussia. With this, NKVD cryptographers traced the network, intercepting messages and feeding false intelligence back to German handlers. By early 1944, the infiltration units were systematically hunted down, with survivors executed or sent to gulags under charges of espionage. Yet even in defeat, Iron Wolf left scars. Entire Soviet brigades had been decimated by fratricide and confusion, their losses quietly attributed to enemy action rather than internal deception. To admit the truth would have meant acknowledging that German infiltrators had, for a time, manipulated the Red Army itself. The files remained hidden for decades, suppressed first by Stalin's regime and later by Soviet historians unwilling to expose vulnerabilities in wartime command. Western governments, too, showed little interest in publicizing the operation, perhaps wary of revealing how easily military structures could be corrupted from within. When fragments finally emerged in the 1970s, they were met with silence. The KGB maintained that Iron Wolf had been an insignificant German diversionary tactic, dismissing the evidence of widespread disruption. But the Black Files tell a different story, a story of forged orders, stolen identities, and soldiers killed not by enemy fire, but by the weight of deception. Perhaps the most haunting element lies in a final, cryptic NKVD memo, dated December 1943. It records the interrogation of an infiltrator who claimed his orders did not originate solely from German command. Under pressure, he insisted, "We were told foreign men of influence approved this mission. They wanted the Red Army to bleed from within." The document ends abruptly with the words, "Subject executed, statement unverified." Whether this was the delusion of a desperate spy or the trace of a deeper conspiracy remains unresolved. The files close, but the questions linger. Who else beyond Berlin benefited from the chaos sown by Iron Wolf? And why did governments choose to bury its memory beneath layers of silence? Chapter 2: The Forgotten Pact of Operation Red Ash. The story of Operation Red Ash begins not on the battlefield, but in the dimly lit corridors of wartime negotiation rooms, where deals were struck away from the eyes of soldiers and the public. The fragments of its existence were not uncovered until decades after the guns of 1945 fell silent, when intercepted OSS transmissions, once locked in Soviet vaults, were finally released in the 1980s. These transmissions reference prisoner movements that should not have occurred, names of German scientists that disappeared from Allied watch lists, and British coded phrases that pointed toward an agreement concealed beneath the official records of the Yalta Conference. To this day, Operation Red Ash remains one of the most unsettling allegations of the war, that Britain, in its desperation to secure technological superiority, cut clandestine deals with the collapsing Reich while publicly demanding unconditional surrender. By late 1944, the balance of the war in Europe was tilting irrevocably against Germany. The Allies pressed from the west, the Soviets from the east. Amid this tightening noose, the Third Reich sought bargaining chips beyond the battlefield. Among its most valuable assets were its scientists and their projects. The V-2 rockets raining destruction on London, the jet propulsion systems years ahead of Allied designs, and chemical and nuclear research cloaked in secrecy. British intelligence, particularly within MI6, recognized the strategic value of securing these mines before Stalin's forces could seize them. It was under this shadow of urgency that secret channels were opened. The codename Red Ash first appears in OSS decrypts intercepted by the NKVD in December 1944. These messages, stamped ultra-black, referenced special consignments moving from Buchenwald and Dachau, guarded not by Waffen-SS detachments, but by men identified as Allied operatives. Soviet cryptographers grew suspicious, suspecting that prisoner exchanges were taking place beyond the terms of Geneva Conventions. According to later testimony from Soviet General Ivan Serov, then head of counterintelligence in the First Ukrainian Front, we received reports that Allied convoys were transporting Germans out of camps. But these Germans were not ordinary soldiers. They were technical experts, engineers, and medical specialists. One declassified British War Cabinet memorandum, dated January 1945, bears the chilling annotation, "Ensure deniability in case of Soviet inquiries. All transfers must be recorded as humanitarian exchanges." Yet the names tied to these humanitarian exchanges would later resurface in entirely different contexts. Scientists such as Dr. Walter Thiel, noted for his work on liquid-fueled rockets, vanished from German records after February 1945, only to appear months later in reports from American and British rocketry programs. Their movements never appeared in official POW registries. RAF personnel liberated from camps in the same period, meanwhile, were curiously absent from standard repatriation lists. Their files marked instead as clerical anomalies. The mechanics of Red Ash relied on covert convoys, archival fragments from captured German railway. Ledgers mention unregistered trains departing Dachau between March and April 1945. These transports did not head toward known extermination routes but westward, into zones under imminent Allied control. Soviet surveillance units reported that some of these convoys bore markings of the International Red Cross, a cover designed to mask their true purpose. Witness statements collected after the war described guarded transfers at night, with British officers present alongside German guards, an image that clashed violently with the public narrative of uncompromising Allied resolve. The Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, provides a crucial backdrop. While Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin publicly projected unity, the unspoken reality was a scramble for post-war advantage. Britain, facing the decline of its empire and reliant on American industrial might, sought to carve its own foothold in the looming Cold War. Securing German scientific expertise before the Soviets could claim it offered precisely such leverage. Operation Red Ash thus became a clandestine battlefield within the larger struggle for the spoils of victory. Yet it demanded silence, for if revealed, it would have shattered Allied unity and handed Stalin a propaganda weapon of immeasurable power. Evidence of the Pact's concealment appears most starkly in the British archives. Files pertaining to prisoner exchanges from 1944-45 remain conspicuously absent, many destroyed under routine administrative clearance. One surviving fragment, however, survives in the notes of a War Cabinet subcommittee meeting from March 1945. Priority must be given to recovery of technical personnel. Standard POW protocols may be bypassed in exceptional cases. Soviet cooperation not advised. This dry, bureaucratic, Phrasing masks decisions that condemned thousands of ordinary Allied prisoners to languish in camps while scientists of the Reich were spirited away under secret protection. The Soviets never forgave what they suspected but could not fully prove. In 1946, NKVD reports accused the British of conducting black exchanges with Reich authorities, warning that such actions violated both the spirit and the letter of Allied agreements. Stalin himself reportedly raged at Churchill in private correspondence. Though no official record was kept, the Western Allies denied all charges, branding them as Soviet fabrications. Yet the pattern of missing POWs, unacknowledged convoys, and resurfacing scientists was too consistent to ignore. The legacy of Red Ash bleeds into the post-war world. Many of the scientists allegedly secured under the Pact contributed directly to Britain's early rocketry programs, and some eventually migrated to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Their presence in Western laboratories, while Soviet researchers struggled with captured remnants, deepened the technological divide that defined the early Cold War. Meanwhile, the families of Allied POWs who never returned received no answers, their loved ones lost in a bureaucratic fog of missing in action. The silence of their governments was the final insult. The true scope of Red Ash may never be fully known. Too many files were destroyed, too many records erased under the guise of clerical error. Yet the fragments that survive, intercepted transmissions, Soviet accusations, and the unexplained reappearance of German scientists in Allied employ, form a mosaic that points to a chilling reality. In the dying months of World War II, as millions bled on the front lines, deals were struck in shadows where principles bent to the calculus of future power. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender from Germany, but behind closed doors, conditional bargains were made with the very architects of German war technology. In this silence lies the essence of Operation Red Ash, a forgotten pact, buried beneath the ashes of war, but leaving behind embers that still glow in the archives of history. Chapter 3. Operation Silver Glacier in the Alps. The declassified traces of Operation Silver Glacier lie buried in the vaults of the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, marked under the label Hydrological Warfare, Not for Release. At first glance, the documents appear like the routine detritus of war: topographical maps, engineering assessments of alpine dams, and memoranda stamped with the acronym SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. But when read together, they reveal a chilling possibility. In the winter of 1945, with the war nearing its conclusion, Allied strategists considered detonating German-held dams in northern Italy, not merely to cripple Wehrmacht defenses, but to unleash devastating floods that would hinder the Soviet advance into Central Europe. The codename given was Silver Glacier, a title that evokes both the cold mountain valleys of the Alps and the icy calculation required to contemplate mass civilian casualties for strategic gain. The plan emerged during late 1944, as Anglo-American leaders anticipated not just the defeat of Germany, but the shape of the post-war map. By this stage, the Red Army had torn through Poland and stood poised to cross into Austria and beyond. Churchill, increasingly wary of Soviet ambitions, urged measures to limit Moscow's influence in southern Europe. Intelligence reports from the OSS suggested that the Wehrmacht had already mined several dams in the Italian Alps, prepared to unleash torrents of water as a scorched earth defense. Rather than merely neutralizing these explosives, Allied planners saw an opportunity: seize the dams, trigger controlled detonations, and redirect the floods against advancing Soviet formations expected to cross the Adige and Isarco valleys. The engineering assessments were exhaustive. One surviving US Army Corps of Engineers file, dated January 1945, contains detailed calculations of water volumes stored in reservoirs such as the Reschen See and Lake Vernacht. Diagrams sketched in red pencil outline flow projections. Entire valleys inundated within hours, railways washed away, bridges swept aside. A note in the margin reads, starkly, estimated civilian casualties, 40,000 to 60,000. Acceptable losses if buffer achieved. The cold arithmetic of war reduced alpine towns, farms, and centuries-old villages into variables in a strategic equation. The operation demanded secrecy at the highest levels. A memorandum stamped "Eyes Only," SHAF, reportedly circulated to Eisenhower in February 1945, records his hesitation. Hydrological warfare carries political risks beyond military necessity. To devastate neutral populations for strategic containment undermines the very principles we claim to defend. Yet Churchill, according to a parallel Foreign Office note, pressed strongly for contingency planning, writing in his characteristic bluntness, "If we cannot hold the Soviets by force of arms, we may hold them by nature's flood." The clash of perspectives underscored the deepening fractures within the Allied coalition. Italian partisans, long allied with the OSS, were secretly approached for reconnaissance. Reports from partisan cells operating near Bolzano and Murano described nighttime surveys of dam sites, German guard rotations, and the condition of detonator charges already installed by Wehrmacht engineers. One partisan message, smuggled through the Apennines in March 1945, reads, "The Germans fear destruction, but also hope it may serve as their last weapon. The Allies ask if we would aid in ensuring these waters are turned not against Germany, but against Russia." Such words illuminate the moral ambiguity forced upon men fighting not for empire, but for their homeland. Suddenly thrust into a global chess game, Silver Glacier required coordination across multiple Allied branches. OSS officers drafted sabotage protocols, while British SOE operatives compiled lists of civilian evacuation routes should detonations be authorized. Yet every plan ran headlong into the same obstacle: how to justify or conceal the deliberate flooding of populated valleys. A secret British War Office briefing proposed one solution: attribute the destruction to retreating Wehrmacht forces. If floods are unleashed, the memo advises, blame must be shifted entirely upon German scorched earth policies. No Allied connection must be inferred. This deception, chilling in its pragmatism, reveals how even humanitarian catastrophes were envisioned as instruments of propaganda. The operation advanced to its final planning stage in April 1945. By then, the Red Army was pushing into Vienna, and Stalin's forces threatened to spill further into the Alps. Draft orders for Silver Glacier lay waiting in Allied field offices in Verona and Florence, marked with activation codes and timing instructions. Engineers were positioned, partisans primed. But then the political landscape shifted. Roosevelt's death in April left Truman at the helm, and American command grew increasingly wary of any operation that could stain the moral high ground. At the same time, reports arrived that German garrisons guarding the dams were collapsing, retreating toward the Brenner Pass. Without Wehrmacht resistance in place, the justification for such drastic measures weakened. By early May, as Germany sued for unconditional surrender, Silver Glacier was quietly shelved, its papers locked away under seals of classification. The legacy of the plan, however, did not vanish. In NATO deliberations during the Korean War, Silver Glacier's blueprints were referenced in debates about hydrological warfare, whether rivers, dams and floods could be militarized against advancing enemy formations. The very existence of these references confirmed that the operation had been more than idle speculation. It had been drawn to the edge of execution. To this day, the archives contain chilling annotations about civilian cost-benefit ratios, revealing a calculus that weighed human lives against geopolitical advantage. The suppression of Silver Glacier reflects more than military discretion. For post-war Italy, already devastated by occupation, to learn that its own Allied liberators considered drowning entire valleys for political gain would have been intolerable. For the world, it would have exposed the fragility of Allied unity, showing that even before Germany's defeat, the Western powers and the Soviet Union were already maneuvering against one another. The Cold War did not begin in 1947 with Truman's speeches. It whispered through memoranda in 1945 in places like the Alps, where water behind stone walls was nearly unleashed as a weapon of betrayal. In the final surviving file on Silver Glacier, an anonymous officer scrawled a single line in pencil before the order was archived. "The mountains kept their silence, let us keep ours." For decades, governments obeyed that silence. But paper does not forget, and the echoes of the operation remain, hidden in the damp archives of counterintelligence. A reminder that even the serene valleys of the Alps were once marked as potential graveyards in the ruthless arithmetic of war. Chapter 4. The Phantom Convoys of Baltic Shadows. The trail of Baltic Shadows begins with a single decrypted Soviet naval log, dated March 1945, recovered from the archives of the Baltic Fleet headquarters in Kronstadt. The entry is terse, written in the language of suspicion. Unidentified vessels bearing Red Cross markings departed Königsberg under escort, destination uncertain, cargo believed irregular. For decades, such notes were dismissed as routine wartime confusion, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a flood of classified naval records emerged, and together they painted a picture of a clandestine maritime operation in the dying months of the war. These were not relief ships carrying medicine or food, as their painted hulls claimed. They were phantom convoys, disguised German-Finnish efforts to smuggle looted assets, war criminals, and experimental weapon prototypes across the Baltic Sea, aided by falsified humanitarian documents. The operation bore a codename found in Gestapo Maritime Division files, Schattenflotte, or Shadow Fleet, known in Soviet reports as Baltic Shadows. The context was desperation. By March 1945, East Prussia was collapsing under the Red Army's assault. Königsberg, once a proud bastion of the Reich, became a staging ground for frantic evacuations. While Operation Hannibal, the mass exodus of civilians and military personnel, has been well documented, Baltic Shadows operated in its margins, under layers of deception. Where Hannibal evacuated soldiers and refugees in the open, shadow convoys slipped away in secrecy, often at night, with manifests that bore the stamps of the International Red Cross. Soviet reports noted that some of these documents carried signatures suspiciously resembling those of Swedish consular officials, though Sweden never admitted to sanctioning them. The deception was meticulous. White-painted hulls, Red Cross emblems on deck, and crews drilled to parrot humanitarian cover stories. The cargo was not people alone. NKVD surveillance of Stockholm's docks recorded unexplained arrivals of heavily guarded crates in April 1945. Witness accounts from dock workers, debriefed years later, described containers stenciled with Luftwaffe codes linked to jet propulsion projects. Others marked with chemical hazard symbols. A handful of crates bore no labels at all, only layers of wax seals and tar coverings. The Soviets suspected uranium samples, intended for ongoing German atomic research, though no physical proof survived. What is certain is that several of the scientists later appearing in Allied post-war programs had last been sighted in Königsberg before vanishing. Aboard these phantom ships, the convoys' routes were designed for invisibility. Charts seized from the Gestapo Maritime Division describe black corridors. Sea lanes patrolled lightly by German Kriegsmarine units but avoided by Soviet destroyers, relying on neutral waters near Gotland and the Åland Islands. Finnish collaboration was crucial. Naval intelligence files recovered in Helsinki decades later confirmed that Finnish officers provided pilot boats and local guides to shepherd disguised vessels through mine-strewn channels. Officially, Finland had exited the war after signing the Moscow Armistice in September 1944. But fragments of correspondence suggest that elements within its navy continued cooperating with the Germans in exchange for gold and future political favors. One note from a Finnish officer, scrawled hastily in 1945, reads, "The cargo is not ours to question. Payment is in bars, not marks." Soviet pursuit was relentless but inconclusive. Patrol reports from April 1945 detail sightings of ghost ships that slipped into fog banks, their lights extinguished, only to reappear hours later under neutral flags. Intercept attempts were often aborted due to fears of violating international law if the vessels proved to be genuine Red Cross relief ships. This hesitation allowed several convoys to vanish into Swedish harbours, where they were promptly disassembled, their cargo dispersed beyond the reach of Soviet inspection. By May 7th, the day before Germany's surrender, the final convoy recorded under Baltic Shadows left Pillau under cover of darkness. It disappeared from all official records thereafter. The aftermath is as telling as the operation itself. None of the supposed humanitarian convoys appear in Allied post-war reparations claims. No detailed records exist of the looted gold, artwork, or weapon prototypes they allegedly carried. Yet traces of their cargo resurface in unexpected places. A Mir 262 jet schematic, once believed destroyed in Berlin, appears in a British Air Ministry file from 1946, with no explanation of its provenance. Swedish financial records, partially declassified in the 1970s, show sudden deposits of Reichsbank gold in Stockholm banks immediately following May 1945. Even more suspiciously, several German officers wanted for war crimes vanished without a trace, their last confirmed locations tied to East Prussian ports. Among them was Dr. Hans Kammler, architect of Nazi underground weapons projects, whose fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the war. Why the silence? Allied intelligence almost certainly knew of Baltic shadows. Declassified MI6 reports reference parallel efforts to secure German technology before the Soviets could seize it, a phrase disturbingly similar to those used in the context of Operation Red Ash. The Americans, engaged in Operation Paperclip, had every incentive to turn a blind eye to phantom convoys that ferried scientists and prototypes to neutral shores. For the British, allowing the Reich to bleed assets into Sweden may have seemed preferable to letting Moscow expand its spoils of war. And for Sweden itself, neutrality often meant pragmatic compromise. Humanitarian cover provided plausible deniability, while material gain secured the nation's post-war position. The Soviet Union seethed, but could not fully expose the scheme without implicating supposed allies. Publicly, Moscow denounced German attempts to smuggle assets across the Baltic, but the deeper charge, that the West colluded by omission, remained buried beneath Cold War diplomacy. The NKVD preserved its suspicions in classified dossiers, marked for party eyes only, warning that enemy cargo has reached the West under cover of neutrality. These warnings were quietly archived, their accusations too dangerous to wield openly in the fragile balance of the emerging post-war order. What became of the phantom cargo? That question lingers unanswered. Some believe the convoys carried the missing Reichsbank reserves, gold that later surfaced in Swiss and Swedish vaults. Others suspect they ferried experimental weapons, rocket blueprints, nerve agents, even components of Germany's aborted atomic program. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that they carried people, SS officers, scientists, and war criminals whose disappearance remains unexplained. Whatever the truth, the absence of records is itself a clue. The erasure was deliberate, a silence constructed by governments unwilling to admit how much they permitted to slip away in those final chaotic weeks of the war. In the end, Baltic Shadows embodies the essence of forbidden history. Ships painted as saviors, but carrying secrets across waters heavy with deceit. The convoys sailed into the fog of the Baltic and never returned. Their cargo scattered into the vaults of neutral banks, the laboratories of Western powers, and the graves of unmarked histories. The archives close abruptly in May 1945, the last line in the final Soviet report reading simply, "The fleet vanished. The shadows remain." In the aftermath of the war, when the smoke cleared from shattered cities and the maps of Europe were redrawn, not all truths rose with the dawn of peace. Some remained buried, locked behind vault doors, their files stamped with the words, "Eyes only," or "Destroy after reading." The official history spoke of liberation, alliances, and justice, but the archives whispered something darker, of secret pacts, phantom fleets, and operations so morally corrosive that governments preferred silence over revelation. These forbidden operations were not accidents of war, nor the isolated excesses of rogue officers. They were sanctioned strategies, debated in war rooms, and executed under cover of shadows, then deliberately erased from the record. Yet the paper trails were never entirely destroyed. A misfiled telegram here, a missing prisoner list there, a declassified map bearing the faint pencil marks of sabotage. Together, they reveal the outlines of a hidden conflict, where the lines between ally and enemy blurred, and survival meant betrayal disguised as necessity. The unanswered questions remain as sharp as ever. How many prisoners vanished into the fog of covert exchanges? How many civilians were weighed against strategic calculations in alpine valleys? How many convoys slipped across the Baltic, their cargo shaping the future balance of power? These are the cracks in the narrative, the shadows where official history dares not tread. And as each fragment surfaces, one truth grows unavoidable. The Second World War was fought not only in trenches and skies, but also in silence, secrecy, and lies that echo still.